This video is about cells. It's about the things that all cells have. And all cells have cell membranes, DNA, ribosomes, and cytoplasm. And in this image, the black circle is a cell membrane. The red represents the DNA. The dark blue dots represent the ribosomes. And the light blue represents the cytoplasm. Cells are made out of the four macromolecules. So the four macromolecules combine to form cells. And cells are the smallest living things. And all living things are made of cells. If we look at the sequence, we have our CHNOPS elements. They combine to form simple organic molecules. And these simple organic molecules combine to form macromolecules, lipids, nucleic acids, proteins, and carbohydrates. And we can use those to build cells. Many living things are made out of just one cell. And so they're called unicellular. Uni means one. So unicellular organisms are made of just one cell. For example, bacteria are unicellular. And this is an image of a bacterium. Other organisms are made out of many cells, and so we call them multicellular. Multi means many, so multicellular organisms are made out of many cells. For example, mushrooms, flowers, and rabbits are multicellular organisms. All cells have a cell membrane. They have DNA, they have ribosomes, and they have cytoplasm. And so we're going to talk about each one of those. If we look at the image again, we have the black circle as the cell membrane, the red represents the DNA, the dark blue represents the ribosomes, and the light blue represents the cytoplasm. All cells have cell membranes. Cell membranes are basically the skin of the cell. They surround the cell and hold its contents inside. Cell membranes are made out of phospholipids, and cell membranes have two layers of phospholipids. That's why they're called phospholipid bilayers. Bi means two, so a bilayer would have two layers. So as you can see in the image, we have the first layer and then we have the second layer. This is a phospholipid bilayer. It's also a cell membrane, and we could also call this a plasma membrane. These are all terms that refer to cell membranes. Again, cell membranes are the skin of the cell. They surround the cell and they hold its contents in. But cell membranes do let some things in. They also let other things out. Well, they don't let everything in, they don't let everything out, just some things. That's why we call cell membranes semi-permeable. Semi means partially. And so cell membranes, they let some things in, they let some things out, and so we call them semi-permeable. A couple of terms that's helpful to understand. Concentration. Concentration refers to, well, it can refer to many things, but concentration in this instance refers to how much of something is in a given space. For example, if we put all of the high school students in one classroom at the same time, they would be highly concentrated. We'd have a lot of one thing in one place. A gradient is a difference in a property between one spot and another. For example, if it's hot at the front of the classroom, but cold in the back of the classroom, then there's a temperature gradient between the front and the back of the classroom. So a concentration gradient is when there's more of something in one place versus another. For example, if there's more salt outside of a cell than inside it, there's a concentration gradient of salt between the outside and the inside of the cell. These terms seem a little confusing at first if you're not familiar with them, but when you hear them in context, I think they'll begin to make more sense. We need to learn about types of movement through cell membranes. There's only two types we'll talk about. And the first is diffusion. Diffusion is when a substance passes through the cell membrane without the cell using any energy. And that's a key point. Diffusion does not require the cell to use energy. For instance, if there's a high concentration of a molecule outside of a cell, there's a lot of something outside the cell membrane, and there's a low concentration inside, and the molecule might diffuse through the cell membrane. It would be moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And we call this moving along a concentration gradient. And this would be an example of diffusion. It wouldn't require any use of energy on the part of the cell. It would happen naturally. Another type of movement across cell membranes is active transport. Active transport is when a substance moves across a cell membrane and the cell has to use energy to make this happen. And the key point here is that active transport requires the cell to use energy. In diffusion, the cell does not have to use any energy to help the substance move across the cell membrane. But in active transport, the cell does have to use energy. Well, why? Well, one reason the cell may have to use energy to move a substance across its membrane would be that the molecule, the substance, was moving against a concentration gradient as opposed to moving along a concentration gradient as in diffusion. When a molecule moves from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration, we call this moving against a concentration gradient. And moving against a concentration gradient requires energy. So that's why sometimes the cell has to engage in active transport, meaning using energy to move a substance across a cell membrane, because sometimes a substance will be moving against a concentration gradient. Maybe a cell has a lot of something inside of it, but it wants even more. So in order to draw substances from outside of the cell membrane into the cell, it'll have to use energy. And when a cell uses energy to move substances across its membrane, we call that active transport. The biology MCAS often asks about movement across cell membranes. So let's look at some MCAS questions. The diagram below shows changes in the concentrations of sodium and potassium ions inside and outside a nerve cell. We don't even need to read the second sentence. We know that we're talking about the concentrations of substances inside and outside of a cell. What we have down here is basically a before and after picture. I'm just going to label them 1 and 2. And what's telling us that we're looking at a sequence, we're looking at a before and after picture, is that little arrow. In the before picture, we're not even going to worry about which one's potassium, which one's sodium for now. We have more little black circles outside of the cell, and we have more little white circles inside the cell. In other words, the black circles are slightly more highly concentrated outside the cell than inside. And the inverse is true for the white cells, the white circles, that is. The white circles are slightly more concentrated inside the cell than outside. What we see in the after picture is not that these little circles diffused along the concentration gradient. We see that the little black circles, they're even more highly concentrated outside the cell. And the little white circles are even more highly concentrated inside the cell. So how did this happen? Well, the cell made it happen. It moved the black circles out and it moved the white circles in. And since it was moving both substances against a concentration gradient, it moved both of them from areas of low concentration to high concentration. Since it was doing that, that requires energy. And we know that when a cell moves substances across its membrane and it requires energy, that's called active transport. So I'll read the question, but I just gave you the answer. Which of the following processes is directly responsible for these changes in the concentrations of sodium and potassium ions inside and outside the nerve cell? And of course the answer is A, active transport. Which of the following is an example of active transport? A. Chromosomes migrating during cell division. B. Water diffusing throughout the cytoplasm of a cell. C. Cilia moving rapidly to propel a single-celled organism through water. Or D. Proteins moving ions from low to high concentrations across a cell membrane. Well, the answer is D. When you're moving substances from low to high concentration, that requires energy because you're moving against the concentration gradient. Iodine is moved against its concentration gradient into the cells of the thyroid gland. Iodine is used by the thyroid cells to produce a hormone. Which of the following processes moves iodine into the thyroid cells? Of course, the answer is A, active transport, because we're moving iodine against a concentration gradient. All living things are made of cells, and living things can be unicellular, made of one cell, or they can be multicellular, made of many cells. All cells have a cell membrane, DNA, ribosomes, and cytoplasm. And we've only looked at the cell membrane so far. A cell membrane is made out of a phospholipid bilayer, and two ways of transporting substances, or I should say moving substances across the cell membrane, are diffusion and active transport. Diffusion does not require energy from the cell. Active transport does require energy. And one of the key factors in whether a substance will diffuse across the cell membrane or whether or not the cell has to use energy to actively transport the substance, one of the key factors in determining which type of movement is used is the concentration gradient, whether a substance is more highly concentrated inside or outside of the cell. All cells have DNA, and DNA stores genetic information. And all genetic information is instructions for building protein. Genetic information consists of instructions for building proteins. And RNA is going to take these instructions and carry these instructions to ribosomes. So RNA carries these instructions to ribosomes. And RNA then helps the ribosomes construct proteins using these instructions. Ribosomes are an example of an organelle. Now, our bodies have organs, and organs are specialized structures. They perform specific functions in our bodies. For instance, we have lungs for breathing, we have a stomach for digesting, we have a heart for pumping blood. We might mention other organs such as our skin or our brain. Organs are specialized structures, and we're used to the idea of organs. Well, cells also have organs, but we call them organelles, or little organs. So organelles are the specialized structures within cells that perform the functions of the cell. And different types of cells have different types of organelles. But one organelle that all cells have is ribosomes. So ribosomes are a type of organelle. Ribosomes work with RNA to make proteins. We mentioned that DNA contains the instructions for building proteins, and RNA carries those instructions to the ribosomes. So the ribosomes are going to work with the RNA to make the proteins. And again, all cells have ribosomes, and all cells have ribosomes because all cells make proteins. I want to show you how ribosomes are represented in diagrams on the MCAS. Ribosomes are smaller than other organelles that can be found in cells. So the diagram below shows a cell with 4 of its parts numbered. Which numbered part is a ribosome? The answer is A, and that's because this little dot here, labeled 1, is the smallest organelle within the cell. So this is how ribosomes are represented in diagrams, in particular on the MCAS. Here's another MCAS question. What is synthesized by ribosomes? And synthesized just means to make. A, carbohydrates, B, lipids, C, nucleic acids, or D, proteins? And the answer is D, proteins are synthesized by ribosomes. Finally, let's take a look at the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is everything in the cell other than the nucleus, and only some cells have a nucleus. So if we take a look at our diagram, we have the black representing the cell membrane, the red representing the DNA, the dark blue dots represent the ribosomes, and the light blue represents the cytoplasm. When we say that everything in the cell other than the nucleus is the cytoplasm, do we mean that ribosomes are part of the cytoplasm? Yes, we do. It'll also sometimes be said that ribosomes are in the cytoplasm. It's said either way. And the same thing might be said of the DNA in a prokaryotic cell, such as the one we're looking at. The cell that we're looking at has no nucleus, so the red representing the DNA is just floating in the cytoplasm. And we could say that the DNA is just part of the cytoplasm in this image. So this word gets used in both ways. The ribosomes and the DNA in this image are part of the cytoplasm, or we could say that they float in the cytoplasm. Again, the word is used in both ways. I want to show you an example of the word cytoplasm being used on the MCAS. Don't worry about the specific question right now. I just want to highlight that the word cytoplasm is right here, and notice what it's pointing to. On diagrams, cytoplasm is usually labeled as this empty space between all the other organelles. And that's fine, but I just told you, and it is the case, that all these other things that I'm highlighting, they're part of the cytoplasm. So these things are part of the cytoplasm. The only thing that isn't part of the cytoplasm is the nucleus right here. So just know that when you see the word cytoplasm, it's often going to be pointing to the blank space between the organelles, but all the organelles are part of the cytoplasm by definition, just not the nucleus. But here's an example of that word, cytoplasm, being used on the MCAS. All cells have DNA. DNA stores genetic information. And all genetic information is instructions for making proteins. And RNA transports these instructions, and it also helps construct proteins. Proteins are constructed at ribosomes. Ribosomes help construct proteins. In ribosomes, all cells have ribosomes, and they're an example of an organelle. And organelles are just specialized structures. They're little organs. And all cells, finally, also have cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is just everything in the cell other than the nucleus, if the cell has a nucleus.